Hey, bitches! Check out another podcast from Toil and Trouble Media, The Haunted Hustle, and its two-part debut about the Fox sisters. Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. In 1848, Margaret Fox had a problem. She couldn't get her daughters to sleep. The girls wouldn't rest. Every night at bedtime, they stayed up for hours, their giggles and silly chatter carrying on until dawn. It had gotten so bad that she and her husband John had begun to send the girls off to bed right after 6, just for a reprieve. But as the weeks wore on, it was only getting worse. It did no good to chastise the girls. When scolded, they claimed they couldn't sleep from all the sounds that filled the family's small bedroom. No one else in the house had heard anything of the kind, but the girls insisted it was true and that the house was haunted. One cool March night, Margaret again found herself at the end of her wits, standing outside the bedroom, listening at the door. The girls were talking, but it wasn't the conversation she expected. "Count to 5, her daughter said. After a moment, she said, "Count to 10. But instead of pleading with her girls to stop, a question entered her mind. What were those noises? I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. Most people presume significant discoveries or religious movements involve mystical events and powerful men. But one of the most influential culture shifts of the late 19th century took place because of a childhood prank. More so, many of the ripples that followed are still present to this very day. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let me introduce you to Maggie, Kate, and Leah, 3 women who would go on to launch the spiritualist movement as the famous Fox sisters. John and Margaret Fox raised their family on a small farm in Hydesville, New York. It was a tight-knit community. They had lived there for decades, had close relationships with their neighbors, and were members of the Methodist Church. They thought their childbearing days were over when their 4 children, including son David and their daughter Leah, grew up and moved out of the house. But 20 years later, Maggie and Kate came along, and the older parents found themselves doing it all over again. Having babies at middle age changes things. Like most change-of-life couples, they didn't parent their younger children the same way they had their elder ones. Without having to split everything 6 ways, they had a little more money and probably a little more patience. For the first-generation siblings, it must have felt like they were completely different people. And it was no doubt a source of contention for David and Leah, who were forced to deal with stricter, more miserly parents. Now young adults, they were sure they had it all figured out and never missed an opportunity to criticize. They questioned their judgment and who was really running the house, constantly accused their parents of being too lenient and spoiling the girls. They barely had enough money to take care of themselves, and yet they doted on the girls every chance they could. It wasn't right. And it's not like they appreciated it, the siblings groused. It was obvious their little sisters, aged 15 and 11, were milking it for all they were worth. Leah and David recalled countless instances when their parents slapped the taste out of their mouths just for imagining being so defiant. They threw in a few more they had invented over the years for good measure. But still, their parents refused to stand up to them and blew them off. Now, before you jump in and judge poor John and Margaret, keep in mind they were exhausted. Leah and David had never done anything like this, and no doubt in between coffee and cat naps, they were in no shape to consider the possibility the girls were being evil little shits. They just weren't the kind of parents who threatened to sell their kids to the gypsies anymore and shouldn't be criticized for it. Although, I confess, I am one of those parents, and we're fun too. No matter what their adult children said, the fact remained evenings at the Foxes didn't quiet down. No sooner would they tuck them into bed than the ruckus would start, and it only grew worse. Eventually, the knocks and bangs erupted through the entire house. Wherever the girls went, noise just followed. It was as if they were being followed by some kind of invisible force, Margaret supposed one day. David told her she was being ridiculous. Leah suspected the girls had finally pushed the old lack-witted woman into her breaking point and she'd finally shot her bolt. But then came the evening in March when, while listening at the door, Margaret heard the children playing a game. And something was answering. But when she entered the room, there they were, just sitting there. She wasn't born yesterday, but there was no way they were doing it themselves. She knew it. The noises were demonic. Any parent knows a child can drive you nuts. Margaret's current mindset probably didn't help. Thoughts of the calendar date, March 31st, or April Fool's Eve, never went through her mind. Nor did any suspicion of why the girls were experiencing poltergeistic activity and weren't scared out of their wits. Instead, she sent John out to fetch the neighbors. When they arrived, they found the women huddled together on the bed. "Now count 5, Margaret ordered. The room shuddered as 5 thuds responded out of thin air. "Count 15, she commanded again. Again, the mysterious presence complied. Margaret looked up at her astounded friend. "What's her age?" she asked. They nearly fainted when the answer, 33, was supplied. "How many children do I have?" 6 raps answered. Feeling emboldened as one would when talking to a spirit with such magnificent accuracy, Margaret continued, "If you are an injured spirit, manifest it by 3 raps. It did. The 1840s were a time of revolutionary change. Captain Charles Wilkes circumnavigated Antarctica. The treaty establishing a formal border between the U.S. and Canada was in its inception, as was the telegraph. In many areas, overcrowding and a lack of proper sanitation or adequate housing led to epidemics of influenza, typhus, typhoid, and cholera. The resulting deaths were devastating. And many societies, including the Methodist Church, were divided over human rights issues like slavery, women's liberation, and police brutality. The idea of local children speaking to specters would have been a great distraction from the death and uncertainty around them. There, amidst the shadows, candlelight, and superstitious hysteria, a tale emerged from the clicks and thumps. One of a 31-year-old peddler who was murdered for $500 by a previous tenant, then buried to conceal the crime beneath the Fox house. It was strange. No one had ever heard of a missing peddler or anyone who might have fit that description. And even though the spirit had been willing to disclose his origin story through the painstaking process of signaling the proper letter of the alphabet over and over and over, no one bothered to ask. Satisfied for the moment, everyone returned home to ponder what they'd seen. In the next few days, the girls' code of raps and bangs began to evolve into a more efficient system. The spirit devised a way to signal yes and no, and a more user-friendly code for the alphabet. and it gave itself a promotion. Maggie and Kate began addressing it as Mr. Splitfoot, in keeping with their mother's demonic possession theory. When the neighbors noticed the inconsistency, the girls changed their story. The spirit was, in life, a murdered peddler named Charles B. Rosna. He just preferred to be called Mr. Splitfoot. Still, in spite of the fact that the explanation made very little sense and that no reports of a person fitting Rosna's description had ever gone missing, townsfolk looked the other way. As word circulated, they began supposing that perhaps there had been a peddler after all, though his connection seems to have been along the lines of a neighbor's, cousin's, librarian's, dog walker's, third-grade teacher. Other rumors followed that David had dug under the house summers before and had uncovered some bones and human teeth. The fact that neither of these held any credibility at all didn't stop some true crime fanatics from getting involved. With no good lead on the victim, they set out to find the potential murderer. Their search of former residents led to a man named Bell, who they reportedly tracked down and brought before law enforcement. He was never arrested, but was still shunned by the community as a murderer for the rest of his days. Soon, word of the mysterious occurrence made its way to the media, where it was dubbed the Hydesville Haunting. To newspapers of the time, it was circulation gold. Two young bumpkins talking to the dead was exactly the kind of story readers gravitated to. Like today's clickbait and supermarket tabloids, they distracted followers from the chaos of everyday life. Even if you didn't believe a word that was written, it was still fun to kick around, and the story spread across the state within weeks. While many were thrilled by the humor and drama, others were genuinely fearful. To the faithful, conversing with a specter known as Mr. Splitfoot could only mean two things: witchcraft and devil worship. Eventually, the Fox's minister told them to stop coming and implored them to leave town. He claimed he feared for the safety of his flock, but as reporters started swarming, he may have also been eager to avoid any appearance of tolerance. Then came the gawkers, then the looks, and the stares. Eventually, the family relented and fled to David's home in Rochester in the middle of the night. But the interest in raps followed. It was a little too little, a little too late. Leah could hardly believe it when she learned of her family's ordeal, but wasted no time butting in. Now married and living in Rochester herself, she and her husband were constantly on the edge of financial ruin. History doesn't record much about him, except for he wasn't particularly successful. By the time Mr. Splitfoot had made his supposed appearance, Leah had to take work as a music teacher to make ends meet, and the couple was on the verge of divorce. But another curious detail history neglects is that the fact that in spite of living nearby, and in fact in the same city her beloved parents fled to, neither they nor David thought to enlist her assistance, or even tell her what was going on. It had been months since Margaret and John brought the neighbors in to witness the girls' mediumship, yet Leah didn't even know they were in town. In fact, the first time she learned anything was amiss was when a student brought a newspaper article to class. And while that's not enough to judge Leah's emotional involvement with her kin, it is noticeable. So is the fact that she wasn't up to date on their current contact information. By the time she rushed home, her family had long gone. But not the crowd of believers still camped out in their lawn, waiting for their return. She was most likely thinking about making the girls ghosts themselves when she reunited with everyone back at David's. But instead, an idea crossed her mind. Recalling the crowd back at the farm, she saw an opportunity. For all the nonsense, stress, and mayhem Maggie and Kate had put them all through, they'd latched onto something. Of course, it wasn't real psychic powers. She knew good and well they were full of crap. But if people were willing to wait day and night for the chance to speak to the dead, maybe they would be willing to pay as well. It's sad the way money can affect familiar relationships, even the mere possibility of it. For all appearances, Leah couldn't have cared less about her sisters before. But as she watched their being grow, that started to change. She repeated many of her old concerns, but from a different angle. A more caring, nurturing one. She expressed how awful it was to see her family treated that way, rejected by their church and mocked like carnies. She shamed curious looky-loos for causing them so much distress. Her dear, elderly, addle-brained parents. What's worse, she claimed, was the abhorrent way poor little Maggie and Kate were treated. Her sweet sisters. Why, when she thought about the awful way those girls had their lives uprooted, been taken away from their friends, taken away from their education, why, it was all she could do not to walk right up and give each one of them a good talking to. Something had to be done, Leah said, and as the older sister, she decided the responsibility fell to her. So she left her husband, quit her job, and took the girls to live with her. Reluctantly, of course. Assuming custody and control seems to be a decision that by all appearances her parents supported. They never anticipated the mounting attention or the way their beloved community would react, and seemed agreeable with letting her shoulder the load. After all, Leah had been very vocal over the years about the way her siblings had been left to their own devices, allowed to run wild without any kind of proper discipline or restraint. Leah promised to look after them and to see to their education and protection. Maybe she was better prepared to handle it than they were. After discussing the matter, they saw Rochester as a fresh start for the girls and their split-footed friend. An editorial in the Scientific American scoffed at their arrival, calling the girls the spiritual knockers from Rochester. But from a marketing standpoint, Leah couldn't have done better. Rochester was on the cutting edge of reform and religious advancements. The area was responsible for the inception of Mormonism, refining radical Quaker ideals, and the birth of Millerism, an apocalyptic sect that focused on the end of days and the second coming. The city was a melting pot for all sorts of Christian offshoots. With each new philosophy came a new congregation and a new way of interpreting the Bible. It was a much more accepting environment for the two young mediums. Even if everyone in town wasn't a believer, there were enough around who were. Once Leah circulated the news of her miraculous sisters, the curious flocked to see for themselves, and the seeds of spiritualism were sown. Spiritualism is the belief that human consciousness not only exists separate from the body, but can interact with the living long before death. It may not seem like much in today's mismatch of global religions, spirituality, and New Age philosophies, but in its day, the concept was revolutionary. It proposed one's final destination was not merely a matter of heaven or hell. The dead could remain with us for eternity. It was neither God's nor the devil's decision, a really radical divergence from traditional Eurocentric teachings. While the term was first coined nearly 50 years earlier by Emanuel Swedenborg, the idea had never really caught on with the general public. For the faithful, it was either too outlandish or frighteningly heretical. But in a climate of political change, technological advancements, societal overhauls, and rampant death and grief, people were reevaluating all sorts of things. Among them was a fair amount of tradition and religious dogma, which people began to see as powerless to explain, much less justify, many of the things they were experiencing. The old go-tos of the Lord acting in mysterious ways or blaming the victim of committing some unknown sin weren't enough. And if there was some way to reconnect with your loved ones, to have them personally advise you and even intercede on your behalf, wouldn't you go for it? As far as religions go, spiritualism was more of an individually driven DIY movement. Instead of relying upon ancient texts and practices interpreted by ministers, it centered upon personal experience. In that way, it was very progressive and accepting. But it also made it difficult to pin down, especially in terms of accuracy and authenticity. When one is allowed to make it up as you go, how can you be sure anything is real? But its practitioners had much to draw upon. Placing so much emphasis on one's personal conclusions, things like facts and reality weren't necessary. Spiritualism focused upon the theater, the performance. So much of it only had to sound good, mysterious, and occulty. Borrowing heavily upon ancient religious practices, the term medium was coined to describe those with a gift, and communicating with the dead required a ceremony, a seance. A few years earlier, American seer Andrew Jackson Davis claimed that Swedenborg's spirit spoke to him during a series of seances. He recorded and published them in 1847 in a compilation titled The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and a Voice to Mankind. It is a truth, he wrote, that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other is in the higher spheres. All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established. They were really into flowery, overworded descriptions that often made the Bible and other religious texts seem like Hallmark cards. You'll see what I mean as we keep going. Among the Fox's first followers were Quaker journalist Isaac Post and his wife Amy. Longtime family friends, they arranged for the sisters to stay at their home under the guise of helping things calm down. But this wasn't really true. They had followed the story from day one and had even participated in a group who journeyed to the Hydesville home in search of evidence. After uncovering what they believed to be confirmation of the mysterious peddler's final resting place, they had to see more. The need to verify is an early divergence between spiritualism and the more conventional faiths of the day. Most sects under the Christianity umbrella incorporate a hefty amount of faith. God is present but not visible. The Messiah was delivered by a virgin, and communion turns wine and wafers into the body and blood of Christ. You can't conclusively prove any of this. You just have to take their word for it. Early spiritualists, like the Posts, needed more, and the expectations surrounding validation only grew. But naturally, in the beginning, nobody admitted as much. I suppose I went in with as much unbelief as Thomas felt when he was introduced to Jesus after he descended, Isaac Post wrote. But after witnessing very distinct thumps under the floor and several apparent answers, he was converted. His impressions were only further cemented when Leah demonstrated that Maggie and Kate weren't the only remarkable foxes. She too had abilities, and proved it by summoning the spirit of her recently deceased childhood friend, the Post's own daughter. Convenient, wasn't it? Talk about validation. Leah's transformation is proof of one thing. She discovered what Maggie and Kate were up to. It was a trick so simple and probably in the eyes of their older, judgmental sister, so stupid. They were making the ghostly knocks and raps by cracking the joints in their toes and ankles. They had no doubt encountered their unusual skill during their hours and hours of unsupervised play, while their parents were either distracted or desperate for a moment's peace. Cracking their joints was simple enough, requiring no more movement than one would use to crack their knuckles. But they soon learned that they could carry the sound much farther by rolling their feet along the floorboards. The cavernous acoustics of the house took care of the rest. Revisiting the months before, we can see the entire evolution of their so-called mediumship. From a quirky and somewhat distasteful practice, when the girls simply kept themselves and their parents awake with chatter, giggles, and a complete absence of any detectable foreign sounds, to more pronounced knocking, and at last the rapping poor Margaret interpreted as demonic. But that's taking a lot for granted, you might think. Surely Margaret wasn't that knuckle-dragging dumb. And she wasn't. But society's impression of women and girls certainly was. Women were still seen very much as less than men, lacking the most basic legal and political rights, as well as much of the control over their lives and bodies. Viewed as weak, simple, and prone to hysteria, women were constantly underestimated, disregarded, and ignored. And the traditional holders of power, spoiler alert, all men, liked it that way. Without equal status, most were forced to depend on the men in their lives, their husbands, father, or other penis-possessing guardians, for their very security and livelihood. If they married, they lost most of their legal rights to property and earnings to their husbands. If they remained single, they faced a lifetime of social stigma and limited options that often left them in poverty. At every societal level, they were paid less than men, educated at a lower standard than men, and recognized as less than men. Being raised in this limited environment herself, the thought that her girls could do such unladylike things, much less to such an impressive degree, probably never even entered Margaret's head. Nor did it occur to their father, their brother, their neighbors, the community, or anyone else. And if it did manage to make it across someone's radar, they didn't say anything. By now, they would have been disagreeing in the face of a crowd of believers. Leah saw it and seized upon it. Once she fooled the posts, she knew she was onto something. Their little prank was going to make her rich. Blinded by their own ambition, the posts were oblivious. Certain they were sitting upon the breakthrough of the century, they told everybody. In time, news of the sisters reached Jackson Davis, who summoned them to his New York City home to witness their talents himself. After a small seance in which the knocks and raps were all over the place, he declared them authentic. He also usurped the power of prophecy for himself and announced a previously unknown retroactive prediction realized. About daylight this morning, he confided in his diary, otherwise known as the first draft of his latest book, a warm breathing passed over my face, and I heard a voice, tender and strong, saying, "Brother, the good work has begun. Behold, a living demonstration is born." The move let him hijack the sisters' discovery and sold a lot of books to boot. Another early distinction between spiritualism and other alternative faiths was the emphasis placed on expertise. Where most sects rely on the interpretations of their sacred books, their leaders don't normally claim to be actual apostles. Jackson Davis, and those like him, changed that. Those who did the work to seek and obtain proof expected full credit and recognition. Like an emerging fad, early association was everything. Those who could say they were on the ground floor of revelation, no matter how biased and half-assed the evidence was, had immediate status. And more. As we briefly alluded to with Jackson Davis, there were significant financial incentives, too. Eager for a share of his street cred, the Post rented the largest hall in town for the sisters' next appearance. No less than 400 people bought tickets to hear the mysterious noises and raps. Under flickering gas lamps, a hush fell over the hall as the girls took their seats on stage and the seance began. On the chair to the right, Leah put Maggie, who, as she was instructed, sat solemnly, trying to look as mysterious as possible under her mop of dark curls. To her left sat Kate, who, try as she might, nearly vibrated with excitement. The audience willingly brushed off the behavior as childish nervousness, but it would later earn her a beating when Leah got the chance. The girls grasped hands. "Is there someone here who wishes to communicate?" Maggie asked. To the audience's shock, the question was followed by a sharp, cracking sound. The girls continued the spectacle just as they had so many times before for their parents and neighbors. They took turns, each shouting out one intentionally vague question after another, interjecting the cracks and snaps of their joints in between. They watched the reaction of the crowd, just as Leah had directed, and steered their supposed translations accordingly. In spite of their rehearsals, Kate went off in the weeds at a few points, but Maggie brought it back around. The audience was aghast, struck by the girls' youth and innocence. They looked almost cherubic as they relayed names, messages of love, and cryptic predictions. They were common enough, but what did they expect from a bunch of bangs and knocks? Plus, they were simple country kids from a poor borough. There was no way they could fool an entire theater of spectators, right? After an evening of curious messages, the final rap was delivered. Following their sister's offstage signal, the girls lowered their heads. "It's finished," Maggie concluded. "Go in peace." Leah added the Bible reference in order to lend a religious undertone to an otherwise blasphemous evening. When the lights were restored, the audience was filled with a sense of illumination. The girls were then gathered, and Amy escorted them to a private chamber, where they were stripped and cavity searched by a group of strangers. Once finished, the self-appointed committee reported no evidence of hoax was found. But then again, neither was any consideration for the children's dignity or welfare. This, the Post declared, was proof, and soon more shows were added. Spiritualism's focus on theatrics and entertainment is hard to ignore. The same burgeoning group of righteous humanists pimping those children out for their own interests is a curious contradiction. But this won't be the last time we see the powerless taken advantage of. Sadly, the movement was just getting started. Attendees paid to see a show. They wanted spectacle. They wanted drama. And most of all, they wanted to witness something remarkable, something missing in their normal lives. And those in the up-and-coming business meant to give it to them. As demand for appearances began to pour in, Leah quickly assumed control. She made herself their manager, moved the girls out of the Post's reach, and arranged more seances, charging the outrageous sum of $1 a sitting. In each venue, they were a hit. Soon, she took the act on the road, and the girls performed for packed theaters throughout America and Great Britain. With each new show, their fame and spiritual mania swelled, as did their detractors. Plenty of people saw through the act. Some laughed even harder when they added communications from the famously departed. When the girls commanded the spirit of Benjamin Franklin to appear, his messages from beyond the grave sounded more like a laborer than a founding father. When a heckler shouted out in the middle of a performance that Franklin's mastery of spelling and grammar must have decayed with his corpse, Maggie angrily stomped away, complaining, "You know I never understood grammar." And the movement itself continued to expand, with societies and forums popping up in every area they went. Many of these reached out to test the sisters' supernatural abilities. A bothersome request, but one that increasingly came with the territory. While most were not as invasive as the exams conducted by the Posts, they did involve examining their bodies, clothing, and undergarments for signs of smuggled assists. They also observed Leah. Prior to a seance, she would frequently mingle amongst sitters, conversing in a way skeptics accused of trying to glean information. Naturally, she protested, insisting it was only innocent small talk. But when those same bits of information would come out in the spiritual responses later, it hardly seemed coincidental. Other times, they were downright annoying. Once, investigators with the University of Buffalo had the girls conduct a seance while sitting on a sofa with pads under their feet. When the spirits were consequently silent, Leah quickly blamed it on the researchers' negative energy. Spirits would only appear to true believers, after all. Kind of like Tinkerbell or Santa Claus. Skeptics called BS, but their followers bought it. It was easier to accept than the church. Spiritualism offered a safe place organized religion didn't. From its onset, believers were drawn to its convenience and flexibility. It made the traditional ministry obsolete. It was no longer necessary to go to church 3 times a week, confess, and pay tithes only to get lip service from a guy who got his authority from a Roman convention, or have your knuckles smacked by a spinster. If you wanted to get your answers from the source, if you wanted to consult with the dead, you could now hire someone. It was God on tap. Every new religion needs its saints, and a key patron of the Foxes was politician and publisher Horace Greeley. Grieving over the death of his son, the founder of the New York Tribune hired the sisters in hopes of reuniting. While there's no record of exactly what transpired, it's safe to presume he was happy with the result. He moved them into his mansion and began introducing them to his famous friends. Soon, the sisters were doing seances for P.T. Barnum, William Cullen Bryant, and James Fenimore Cooper. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison witnessed a session once in which the spirits reportedly professed spiritualism will work miracles in the cause of reform. It was exactly what he wanted to hear. Greeley was so grateful for their services, he offered to pay for the girls' schooling, a life-changing opportunity Leah refused. She wasn't interested in improving their stations in life, just her own. The girls remained a necessary burden, one she cared no more about than a performing elephant or seal. As for Maggie and Kate, the money and fame had done little to help them. They were exhausted, abused, and frequently exploited. None of their sitters seemed to care. No one asked about their welts or bruises. They just wanted to know ridiculous things like who they were going to marry or what railroad stock to buy. And Leah made their lives miserable. She put on a good face as a proper matronly guardian when it suited her, but the only thing that really mattered to her was the next show and the next dollar. She was a cold, distant taskmaster, and all the rapping in the world couldn't save them from it. We'll pick up on their story next week. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Aaron Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.